watching part 18 of this series, The Assault on Our Constitution, with special guest and best-selling author Don Brown.
All right, so let's take a look here. So Jefferson, Madison, John Jay, our fourth Chief Justice, Patrick Henry, and others expressed early on, they expressed concerns about judicial tyranny. Madison and Alexander Hamilton also, as we just saw, said that laws should be strictly construed. Now, here's the question. How are we doing 230 years after the fact in preventing judicial tyranny? That's the question. It's important that we look at that question. Mm-hmm. Now, we go back to where we were with this number, 667 United States District Court judges. Look at the numbers there and keep that number in mind. 667 U.S. District Court judges. Question, what if each one of these 667 U.S. District Court judges in the United States could decide to simply strike down the executive order of a president of the United States or an act of Congress?
It would be the worst chaos. It would be beyond judicial tyranny to judicial anarchy and anarchy in the country.
Right.
No government could function like
But understand that under where we are now in this country, when you look at what this judge here, Robart, did, when you look at what Derek Watson did, and others we'll talk about, they think they can individually decide, one of almost 700 district court judges, they can automatically decide to issue an order and strike down an executive, this isn't even a law, it's an executive order of the president executing a law. They think they can strike that down and call it unconstitutional and just shut the government down, even though Article 3 doesn't allow it, even though the separation of powers has given that responsibility to other branches of government. That's where we are, and that's why we're at a crisis point, Rick.
Yeah, and this is a limit. I don't think it's ever been this bad.
No, it hasn't been.
Nobody's ever presumed to go as far as these guys have.
No, please send this broadcast to others. Let's get our arms around this because the courts are being, federal courts are being politicized. It used to be that you could depend on federal judges to be honorable, and many are. But many are basically left-wing clowns, socialists masquerading as judges. You know, you put a black robe on Barnum and Bailey. That doesn't mean you got a defender of the Constitution.
No. And you could have conservatives doing the same thing.
Exactly.
But right now we have the liberals doing that. It could go either way. It's not about whether you're liberal or conservative. It's about who has the authority to do this. And it's a bizarre breakdown of our government.
Why don't we take a look at some recent cases to see how we are doing, whether we prevented judicial tyranny. On the screen now, you're looking at 3 of the West Coast judges from Hawaii and Seattle who have been involved in striking down these travel bans that the President of the United States has signed pursuant to his legal authority, only to have the Supreme Court reverse every one of them. Now, we'll start with this fellow right here, Judge James Robart of Seattle. He's a Democrat appointed by George W. Bush in a political deal with the Democrat senator from Washington State at the time. And let's look at how he handled a very limited legal travel ban signed by President Trump in 2017. But before we look at this case, 2 questions arise. Where in the Constitution is a district court judge, one of 677, given the power to strike down an executive order of the President of the United States? Where is that in the Constitution?
Yeah, it's not in there.
Right. And question 2, where in Article 3 of the Constitution are federal courts given authority over federal immigration matters?
Not there.
All right. Now, just to be safe, because we are studying the Constitution, and you got to read it. You know, it's kind of like we told the story about what if you go to seminary, and all you're doing is reading, sermons of great preachers, but you're not reading the Bible itself. Right. The principle is the same. Our lawyers and our law students are studying cases written by the Supreme Court, not so much the Constitution. So we put Article 3 back up on the screen, Article 3, and we've done it basically for rhetorical purposes, but do we see anything anywhere in here about a judge having a federal judge having power over immigration?
Obviously not.
Nope. And when we go back to Article 1, Section 8, the question is which branch has initial power over immigration? We see the 18 enumerated branches, and we see that it is the Congress. Congress is given the power to set rules for naturalization and immigration. That is the fourth. That is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4. The courts are not given this power to make rules on immigration or foreigners who can come into the country. And now, since this has happened, you may find this interesting, Rick, as a student of history, but since the immigration clause and naturalization clause, Congress has passed some 31 immigration acts. The very first one was the Immigration Act of 1790. And just for teaching purposes, we'll walk through just a couple of these. We're not going to get bogged down on them. But that very first Immigration Act established, among other things, that children of citizens of the United States may be born at sea or out of the limits of the United States shall be considered natural-born citizens. This was Congress's first attempt to define who is a citizen.
John McCain, born in Panama.
You're exactly right. And that was under the very first Immigration Act adopted by the Congress. The Congress has passed approximately 31 of these Immigration Acts, even more than that, depending on how you count the act, since 1790. And what I've done here, which I thought you might find of interest, is just laid out a few of them. For example, did you know that there was an act in 1882 called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which restricted Chinese laborers from entering the United States for a period of 10 years? The Exclusion Act of
sounds kind of racist, doesn't it? Well, I mean, they're claiming Bush because he's anti-Muslim.
Well, it's a power.
But they have the authority to do it.
That's correct. The Immigration Act of 1903, now get this, added 4 inadmissible classes to that act of 1882. The Congress was concerned about protecting the people of the United States. So that act prohibited at that time people with epilepsy or beggars and importers of prostitutes from entering the United States. Congress has that power. And these foreigners don't have rights or powers to automatically enter. And the Immigration Act of 1906, which I think is still a very good idea, Congress made some knowledge of English at that time a requirement for citizenship. Another act. Then there was the Immigration Act of 1907, which further restricted people with certain diseases. You know, this has been a big deal. You know, the purpose of immigration and controlling immigration is to first and foremost to protect the United States, to preserve the Constitution, and to make sure that our people don't get sick or are otherwise endangered. Then there was the Immigration Act in 1924, which, get this, in 1882, we restricted Chinese laborers from coming in. In 1924, the Congress passed an act which flat out bans immigration from Japan and established quotas from other countries. So you're seeing, as we see this, the history of the Congress's power of immigration, we see it belongs to the Congress under the Constitution, giving powers occasionally to the president as the chief executive to execute these powers. Here's a headline which I thought you might find of interest, Rick. In 1924, immigration bill is passed by the president. Japanese ban becomes effective on July 1st. United States Congress did that, and the Congress has the right to do that.
Now, here's, again, backing up. That's not saying it's right or wrong. We're saying they had the authority to do it. Now, under extenuating circumstances, like you may think, well, it was wrong of Trump to ban people from Muslim countries and just, well, when this is the main source of terrorism, and there were like 27 Muslim countries, he only banned them from 7. And he's saying because this is a source, and they do not have the infrastructure to provide us with information about who these people are. I mean, if you apply for a passport or a federal job or something, you get a background check. That's our government trying to protect us and, you know, from undesirables, from threats. And now we may think, well, just to target one people group like the Chinese or the Japanese, it may or may not be wrong. That's not the issue. Who has the authority to do this and who does not? That's what we're talking about. There are many things that I think, personally, I'm profoundly, pro-life. I believe abortion is wrong. Get into all the reasons. Mine are biblical, and I can establish them to Scripture. But the federal government didn't have that authority anyway. But guess what? Under the Constitution, a state had that authority.
State has the authority,
They could legalize abortion or delegalize it. The federal government, it's given very specific and clear authority and powers, and then we're told whatever's not specifically given to the federal government is remanded to the states and to the people. It doesn't mean what the states do are right or wrong. I would think if they legalized abortion, to me that's still wrong. I would try to persuade people of why it's wrong, but under our Constitution, the states have the authority to do that. The federal government had no authority to impose this on the whole country. Now, let's back up. You may have this in here, the Section 8.
We do? Yeah, we do.
I'll wait to see how you draw it up. To me, that's one of the most illuminating cases of how this is such a terrible violation of the Constitution.
We're going to talk about that, California Proposition 8.
We'll be right back after this message.
Epic Battles of the Last Days by Rick Joyner, a call to arms for the battle between light and darkness. The Triumph of Justice by an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. Transform your view of biblical justice and law. Treason by Don Brown. Follow Lieutenant Zach Brewer in a case that challenges his beliefs and values. Detained by Don Brown. A man and his son dream of freedom but end up in Guantanamo Bay. Breaking the Power of Evil by Rick Joyner. Break free of everything holding you back from God. These books retail for $75.96 plus free shipping on domestic orders. Get them today for only $55. To order, dial 803-548-1114 or visit store.morningstarministries.org.
As we look at the photo there, 1924, Japanese being banned, here's part of the point. A Japanese citizen, a Muslim citizen of another country, a Christian citizen of another country, a Hindu citizen of another country, those citizens have no constitutional right to demand entry or be granted entry. And if it means banning to protect American citizens because this country happens to be majority Muslim, but we also know it's a source of terror, there's absolutely every right to do that. It was President Calvin Coolidge, by the way, who signed the Japanese ban in 1924 on July the 1st. Now, let's move into the Immigration Act that affects this travel ban, which we're going to analyze. Mm-hmm. In 1952, the Congress passed another Immigration Act. It was called the Immigration and Nationality Act, or the INA of 1952, and it restricted immigration. It did an effective job of restricting immigration, allowed the government to deport immigrants or naturalized citizens engaged in subversive activities. There was a concern, the backdrop against this was during the Red Scare. And so there was a concern about it. So if there's subversive activities, if they're communists or acting in the United States and they're not citizens, they could be deported, and also allowed the barring of suspected subversives from entering the country. Part of the language in that act, 1952, which is at Title 8, of Section 1182 of the U.S. Code, discusses inadmissible aliens. Now, this language, I've got it on the screen. Take a look at it. You can screenshot it, whatever you want. The language that I'm going to show you here is the language that President Donald Trump relied upon in instituting the travel ban. It's also the language that other presidents have relied upon, the clear law. This law, passed by the Congress and given to the president to execute its directives, says this: whenever the president finds that entry of any aliens, not some, any aliens, or any class of aliens, which could be Muslim, Hindu, whatever, any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interest of the United States, he, meaning the president, may by proclamation, so he's given the authority by law, for such period as he shall deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem appropriate. That language is pretty clear.
That's what Trump did.
Right.
I mean, it can't be more clear.
Pretty clear.
And this judge out there throws the law out.
Right. He ignores it. Right.
Totally ignores it. Now, let me ask you this, just to What would you have done if you were Trump?
Well, I think the president is going to have to look at Abraham Lincoln. Now, Mr. President, if you're looking out there, I know you watch Andrew Jackson, but you've got to study Lincoln a little bit more in this case. We have to take the position that these courts are beyond their constitutional authority to step into immigration cases or national security cases or military cases. I've given the example. And if I were with the President Trump, I'd say, Mr. President, let me ask you this. What are you going to do if you have to order the USS Carl Vinson to sail from San Diego, or the USS Ronald Reagan to sail because there's a crisis blowing up in the Middle East? What are you going to do when some federal judge enters an order to stop you from allowing the USS Ronald Reagan or Carl Vinson or Nimitz to sail? What are you going to do when PETA or Greenpeace files a lawsuit saying that the carrier pollutes the waters and it must not be set to sail? Are you going to obey that order? And because the principle is the same.
Exactly.
I hope what you'll say, Mr. President, is nice for you to say that, Judge so-and-so, but you're one of 677 judges and I'm the president, and you are stepping outside of your constitutional boundaries. So the president is going to have to ignore any orders.
I would have totally ignored it.
Right.
He could have imposed, now, executive order, you may think, well, that's the president making laws and only the Congress can do that. Executive orders are for the president to use to give directives to carry out the instructions to the executive branch. All he had to do to say to the immigration officers everywhere, don't let people in. I don't care what the court says. Don't do it. I would have totally disregarded that court.
Yeah, but see, part of the problem is, this is why it's so important what we're trying to do here, and this is why we encourage you to send these programs everywhere.
To your congressman,
exactly, because it would have been politically costly for the president to have done that, because the public thinks that these judges have this authority, but they don't. They do have some authority, limited under Article 3, but not to step into areas of immigration and national security and military matters and other matters. And so we have to educate. Now, I think the president should have said, we're not doing it. I think what he should have done is walk through what we're walking through here, explain to the country how these judges are stepping out of the line, and I am going to protect the people of the United States by implementing this travel ban, because he clearly had the legal right to do it. So that's the way it should have been handled. But as we'll see, these things, every one of them have gone up on appeal. Supreme Court slapped them down, but it is, in the meantime, these orders aren't getting implemented by this judicial fiat, which is outside of the scope and power of these judges. Under that very language, by the way, Rick, under the very language that we just read, which comes from the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, other presidents before President Trump have banned aliens from the United States. Most famous example is, when President Obama banned Iraqi citizens for 6 months. Now, liberals didn't say anything about it then, but for 6 months. As a matter of fact, when you look at the previous 5 presidents before President Trump, on the number of times that this language from the statute was used, we see that Obama used it more than anybody, 19 times. George W. Bush 6 times, Clinton used it 12 times, Bush the first used it once, and Reagan used it 5 times. So it's precedential, having been used by other presidents, but nobody went berserk when any of these presidents used it. Nobody tried to go file an action, because, see, this is just obstructionist. It's just an effort to obstruct something that in and of itself is a very benign type thing anyway, because it only lasts for 90 days. You know, it's just it's temporary halt for 90 days from certain countries, and that's it. Anyway, it's President Trump then, in the aftermath of the other 5 presidents who have used this language under this statute, he then, on the 27th of January 2017, a week after his inauguration, he signs Executive Order 13769. 13769, which is entitled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Enemies and to the United States. Now, here's what it does. And this is the first of 3 travel bans that were signed. And we'll see that he went back and tried to modify it a little bit to appease the judges. That didn't do any good. And then later he signed another one that added North Korea and Venezuela to it, which has also been attacked. But under that first travel ban, and we'll just stick with the first one not to get too complicated, what that did, it lowered the number of refugees to be admitted to the United States in 2017 to 50,000. So he's lowered the number of refugees. That's the first thing he does. Suspended the U.S. refugee admissions program for 120 days. and suspended Syrian refugees indefinitely. He also went on to, for 90 days, suspended visas from the following countries: Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia. Have you seen the movie about the Somali pirates in the, Maersk, Alabama? Did you see that movie? These are areas, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen, where ISIS and other Muslim terror groups are festering. And we can see a map there as one map. I've got a couple of maps just showing the countries. Countries in red are the limited number of countries that will be affected by the travel ban. As you can see, many other Muslim countries are not affected by the travel ban, including Saudi Arabia. And here's a little cleaner listing of those countries under the original travel ban. Again, Obama's used it 19 times, Clinton used it 7 times. This order was fully in compliance with that language, of the statute, giving the president the authority under that act. The same one relied on Obama and others, but it was roundly criticized by Democrats and open border advocates. Even poor Chuck Schumer cried. Remember that, don't you, Rick?
Yeah.
Chuck was crying, and the state of Washington, which is overwhelmingly Democratic, sued the president over the executive order. You're looking at the Washington Attorney General there. The state of Washington was the first of 4 strongly Democratic states to sue the president over the executive order. Hawaii joined the fray. We don't have time to focus on all 4 of those, but basically they were saying the same thing. They were calling it a Muslim ban. It's a Muslim ban. It discriminates against Muslims, even though...
Yeah, and you heard them say over and over, it's unconstitutional.
They did say that. Even though the executive order itself never said anything about Islam, said nothing about it. Just because the countries happen to be Muslim countries, they call it a Muslim ban. This is the Democratic Attorney General for the state of Washington grandstanding for the cameras, Mr. Bob Ferguson. Case was brought before James Robart, one of 677 district court judges, who said that the order was a Muslim ban and claimed it discriminated against poor Muslims in these countries in question. Meanwhile, the Trump administration, after Judge Robart did that, the Attorney General appealed that, but they also revised the order and entered another one. The first one was perfectly legal. They entered another one to try to appease the judge. Then Hawaii strikes that second one down. Here's a picture of the judge, Derek Watson, again, one of 677. He judges are going rampant. I mean, they're getting into the business of serving as chief executive by imposing their will. This guy was a Harvard Law School graduate of Barack Obama. They graduated together. And also as the ninth wing, the left wing Ninth Circuit, which is one of 12 appeals courts, upheld these illegal rulings from these judges. The Trump administration entered yet a third travel ban under the same law, that is the 1952 Immigration Act, which added North Korea and Venezuela. Now remember the poor kid that was murdered in North Korea.
Yeah.
Had that travel ban been in effect to keep him from going to North Korea, Otto Wamberger, he would never have been murdered.
Right.
So what happens? They sued the president for that too. That third travel ban, a lawsuit is filed in the fall of 2017, claiming it discriminates on the basis of nationality. Now get this. In 1892, the Congress passed an act limiting the number of Chinese workers. Well, we've got a right to discriminate based on nationality. We have a right to discriminate on any foreign national. But they're claiming, but this is filed as if a foreign national has a right to enter the United States or has a right in the Constitution. In 1924, all Japanese were banned from entering the United States. Now, eventually, 11 months later, the first 2 travel bans made it to the Supreme Court, which struck down the liberal trial judges in the Ninth Circuit and ruled in favor of President Trump. But think about it. And here are 3 of those judges that are now on the screen. For 11 months, they
imposed their will over the will of our president. This should be criminal. That is such a disregard of their oath of office. It is unbelievable.
It is a disregard of the oath of office. They basically ignored the law, ignored the Constitution. And not only that, but for an 11-month period, we are still vulnerable to ISIS. We're still vulnerable to infiltration from those countries which are havens for terrorism, Take Libya, for example. Libya fell in the Libyan Civil War of 2011. We went in and we got rid of Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi had banned the Muslim Brotherhood from Libya. He had also banned al-Qaeda from Libya. We wound up negotiating with al-Qaeda to overthrow Gaddafi, and guess what? Both al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood had returned to Libya by 2012, and ISIS had returned to Libya also. So our own policy turned Libya into a festering haven for terrorists, and the president's travel ban saying, hey, hang on a second, let's get a hold of this. And these left-wing judges just step in to the role of the executive and try to impose national immigration authority outside of their authority. So why are these judges and many like them guilty of judicial tyranny? Why? The answer is next. Here's the reason: because number one, they violated the constitutional boundaries of separation of powers. Just violated.
Right.
They're stepping into in this case, immigration and naturalization, which is reserved for the Congress, for the president to execute. So they violated their separation of powers demarcation. Number two, they just ignore the law. You saw the law.
Yeah.
Our audience saw the law.
Clear as it can
it's
be.
as clear as a bell.
Yeah.
5 presidents before had used it. No ambiguity. And matter of fact, President Trump's 90-day ban was less stringent than Obama's 6-month ban.
Yeah.
And then 3, they are guilty of judicial tyranny because they simply make up reasons for politically motivated orders. Just call it a Muslim, make it up. Call it a Muslim ban. One judge said there is certain animus that indicates that the president may not like Muslims, or words to that effect. In other words, these judges are looking outside of the record. As a judge, you're only supposed to look at the evidence that is before you. But what's before these courts was a very simple executive order simply cutting off immigration from those
they
countries.
had no right to even be reviewing this.
So they're just making it up.
You're watching part 18 of this series. You won't want to miss upcoming Prophetic Perspectives episodes where we continue examining how our Constitution has been violated and is now being attacked, and what we must do to see it restored to its place as the foundation of our republic and the supreme law of the land.
We're called to speak themes that heaven is unfolding to the nations so that we can be in cooperation with what Jesus is building on the face of the earth. And he wants those individuals to have depth of character so that you don't discredit what he's speaking through you and in you. The weightiest matter that was in the heart of God is to provide a bride for his son, and part of the assignment of MorningStar is to help perfect that bride in the end time church. Yes.
On TV, online, on the go, and on your iPad. Tune into Prophetic Perspectives with Rick Joyner, always available on MorningStarTV.com.